Bleeding in the dark, she crawled into his barn carrying proof that would end the man who had killed his wife. And before the week was out, these two strangers would change each other's lives in ways neither of them had thought possible. Tobias Vance had been alone on his Davis Mountains ranch for 3 years when the gunshot cracked through the cold night air. A Mescalero woman named Bidzí had been carrying a stolen army payroll satchel and a bullet in her shoulder for 3 miles when she crawled in through the open barn door and collapsed behind the water barrel. The man who had put that bullet in her was the same man who had killed Tobias's wife on the Lajitas road. Neither of them knew that connection yet, but they were about to find out, and what happened in the days that followed would change both their lives in ways that the cold March dark could not have predicted. Watch this story to its end to find out what she was carrying and what the two of them did with it together. If you enjoy stories like this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin. In March of 1881, Marfa, Texas occupied the edge of what Eastern maps called the frontier, and what the land itself regarded as something else entirely. The Davis Mountains rose to the northwest in broken ridgelines holding the last cold of a high plains winter, and the town was little more than a surveyor's camp that had grown ambitious over the years. A few storefronts, a railroad agent's office, a sheriff whose jurisdiction covered more square miles than he could realistically patrol, and a reputation for transactions that larger cities would have preferred to handle differently. The rangelands spread south into the Chihuahuan Desert without apology. A man could ride from morning to dusk without seeing another living soul, which was one of the reasons Tobias Vance had stayed. He had come to the Davis Mountains 7 years earlier with Marta, because land in the Trans-Pecos was cheap and because both of them valued solitude as a precondition for living on their own terms, rather than as a retreat from the world. They had built the cabin themselves, hauled and cut the timber, laid the hearthstones together over a long August weekend that ended with both of them sunburned and satisfied, planted the kitchen garden in the 3 years out of 5 when the rain cooperated, patched the barn roof twice in hard winters, and the cabin roof once during a July cloudburst that appeared without warning and left just as fast. Marta had been the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of people and make every one of them recalibrate, without doing anything visible to cause it. She was precise and warm and essentially undeceivable, and what she had seen in Tobias was something he had never quite understood. He guessed it had to do with a simple thing. When he was somewhere at noon, he was simply there at noon. Some people find they value that more than they expected to. She had been gone 3 years when the gunshot reached him across the night. The account that came back through the sheriff's report was clean and tidy enough to make a man with any instinct for these things suspicious from the first line. A stray bullet during a tax collection ride on the Lajitas road. An accidental discharge. The deputy who had fired was named Delwood Cage, and he wore a sympathetic expression at the inquest that he maintained without variation across 3 days of testimony. He had a notable hitch in his left leg from an old horsefall injury, and when he walked he listed to port, a gait as individual as a signature. Tobias had memorized that walk with the same automatic attention a man gives to a dangerous animal, categorizing, filing, not allowing himself to forget. He had not done anything with what he filed. He went back to the Davis Mountains, fed his cattle, worked his fences, repaired what broke, and went weeks without speaking to anyone but his 2 dogs and a gelding named Frank. On cold evenings he poured rye and looked at the photograph on the kitchen table, Marta at the river, squinting into the afternoon light, her hair coming loose in the wind, and he did not make plans. He was not, as a matter of deep character, a man who made plans he couldn't honor. The only plan that presented itself in those 3 years was one he could not honor without destroying everything Marta had wanted for him. So he waited. He called it patience. He was not entirely sure it was. On the night of March 14th, 1881, he was sitting at that same table when the barn went quiet in the wrong way. He had learned the barn's sounds over 7 years, until they lived below conscious thought. The horses settling into sleep, the particular creak of the loft boards in a west wind, the low, argumentative murmuring of the goats in the far pen. What he heard at 11 that night was a thump against the north wall, then a scrape, then a silence that was not the barn's ordinary silence. It was the silence of a space that has stopped breathing naturally because something new has entered it, and everything else in the space as noticed. He picked up the Winchester, did not light the lamp, and went out the back door into the March dark. The barn doors were unlatched. He had left them open 2 inches for the air, a warmer day having made the horses restless, and the circulation helped. Inside he stood still while his eyes adjusted. March moonlight came through the slat gaps in pale geometric bars laying themselves across the hay and the packed earth floor. Frank had gone completely motionless in the near stall, which meant he had already taken in the scent of whatever was behind the water barrel. She was collapsed against the far wall, right arm pressed flat across her chest, left arm lowered, back against the planking. She had not made a sound when he entered. She made none now. Her dark eyes found him in the near dark with a directness that was entirely different from fear. He raised the rifle. She did not move. What he registered, in the 3 seconds before he lowered the gun, was her face. There was no fear in it, none at all, not hidden, not controlled, simply absent. What it held was something more careful, a precise, attentive calculation, the expression of a person reading multiple variables at once, measuring the angle of the rifle against the set of his jaw, against the fact that he had come in without a lamp and without shouting. Her left hand rested on the straw a few inches from her belt, near something, but not on it. He registered the distinction without thinking about it. He lowered the Winchester. He leaned it against the stall post. He went back to the cabin. At the stove reservoir he filled a basin. He took the clean flour sack cloths from the kitchen drawer. He brought the lantern turned down low and a box of matches. When he returned she was exactly where he had left her, unchanged except that the blood had moved a little further down her arm. He knelt at what he calculated was a non-threatening distance and pushed the basin across the straw toward her. She looked at the basin, then at him. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a person who has decided to manage pain rather than surrender to it, she took a cloth with her right hand and pressed it to the wound. The lantern between them drove shadows up the barn walls. He sat back on his heels. Whoever shot you will come looking. One flat fact, nothing extra on it. First ranch south of the draw. Anyone tracking from the Presidio Road would stop here first. Nothing from her. I'm not going to turn you in. He kept his voice the same way he kept his hands. Steady, not forcing anything. There's a reason for that. But I want to know what you're carrying before I make a decision I can't undo. She held his gaze for a long count. Then, with the careful, controlled motion of someone working around a badly damaged shoulder, she reached her right hand across her body, unlatched something at her left hip, and raised a satchel. Leather, dark, well-made, Army-issue stitching. A Presidio County Transit stamp on the flap. Every working rancher in the Trans-Pecos knew that stamp. Tobias had seen Army payroll satchels twice, once during a Fort Davis courier run when the soldiers stopped at his place for water, once when a rider heading south had opened one with more pride than judgment. He looked at the satchel, then at her face. She was holding it out without releasing it, and the posture was clear. This exists. It matters, but the decision about what happens to it is mine. He did not need to touch it. All right, he stood, taking the basin and the cloths. There's a pallet in the loft. You can sleep there. The horses are used to company. He went back to the cabin. At the mantel he paused at Marta's pistol, wrapped in its leather, where it had lived since the afternoon he brought her home from the Lajitas road. He checked the load, left it where it was. He did not sleep. At first light he brought a plate of cornbread and a tin cup of black coffee and left them on the third rung of the loft ladder. An hour later the plate was clean and the cup empty, and she was awake in the loft with her back against the boards, watching the barn below with the focused attention of someone who has learned vigilance from instruction rather than instinct. He climbed up to look at the wound. The bleeding had slowed. When he parted the cloth, she permitted this without comment or expression. The damage was a through and through, high on the deltoid, clean entry and exit, nothing vital damaged. He had treated worse on himself, and once on Frank after a fence wire incident, he still thought about with some embarrassment. I need to clean this, or it's going to turn on you. He went for hot water and turpentine, and came back and worked as carefully as he could, and she made no sound through any of it. When he tied off the last knot of the bandage, he sat back and gave her his name. There was a long pause, long enough that he thought perhaps the night had been the limit of what she was willing to exchange. Then, in English, as unhurried and clear as his own, and there was something in the way she produced it that suggested she had been deciding whether to, for some time. She gave him hers, Bidzí, and then, without drama, she knew who he was. Everyone in Presidio County knew Tobias Vance, the rancher from the Davis Mountains whose wife had been shot on the Lajitas road 3 years ago, who had gone to the inquest and walked out and gone home and not spoken publicly about it since. He stayed very still. Her brother was named Nathan. He had been Mescalero, 26 years old, exceptionally good with horses in the way that some people are gifted at music, not through learning but through some combination of instinct and patience and quality of attention that animals responded to without requiring explanation. He had worked at a relay station near the Pecos Crossing, breaking horses for the stage line, and had built enough of a name that the station manager had left him to manage 4 months of work essentially alone. He had never taken anything that was not his. He had never raised his hand against anyone in his adult life as far as anyone who actually knew him would testify, though by the time of the trial, the number of people willing to testify to anything on his behalf had become very small. The charge was murder. A freight courier named Hatch, found dead on the Alpine Road with his strongbox emptied. The evidence, a paper knife with Natan's initials scratched into the handle, found near the body. Natan had sold that knife to a man named Purvis who worked at the relay station 2 years before the crime. Purvis was not called to give evidence. Cage was the arresting officer, the primary witness, and the man who had found the knife. 9 minutes from the drop to the stillness. Cage had also found a way to be compensated for the arrangement. $380 drawn from an Army payroll fund that had been designated to carry Natan's widow through the winter. The paperwork described it as a processing fee. Everyone who understood the territory understood it was something else. Bidzí had taken it back. He looked at the satchel lying in the hay beside her. He thought about Natan's widow, 2 children, the youngest 3 months old. He thought about Delwood Cage and what 3 years of patient waiting had produced, and about what the right moment had turned out to look like. He thought about the listing walk and the inquest and the careful neutral expression Cage had kept across 3 days of testimony. He'll come here regardless. A pause while he worked it through, whether you stay or go. A man with a trail dog can follow your sign from the Presidio Road to this barn. You riding out before daylight doesn't change what he already knows. She waited, watching him. Stay until you can ride, then go north and send the money from Presidio. The postmaster up there doesn't know Cage well enough to be useful to him. I'll handle what comes here. She studied him, that thorough, fast measuring quality she'd had since the first moment in the barn. Then she nodded once, the way you nod when the arithmetic favors a course of action, and there is no good argument against it. He went down from the loft and stood at the kitchen stove for a long time without making anything. He thought about Marta, what she would have done in this situation. She would have had Bidzí in the spare room within the hour, soup on the stove, the fire built warm. He was not Marta, and he had made his peace with that. He did what he could. He made up the spare room cot, dust cover off, quilt from the chest, lamp and matches on the chest, water in the pitcher. Then he went back to the barn and stood at the base of the loft ladder. She came down slowly, holding herself carefully around the damaged shoulder, and she looked at the spare room doorway with an expression he could not entirely read, something she was deciding whether to allow herself. Then she crossed the threshold and lowered herself onto the cot and closed her eyes. He left her there and returned to his work. The first 2 days he mostly let him. On the first morning she slept well past noon. Not surprising. On the second morning he came to the kitchen to find the stove already burning, built correctly, the right amount of wood, made for heat rather than ceremony. She had found the coffee and set it out. He made 2 cups. She took hers to the east window and drank it looking at the yard. He drank his at the table. Neither of them found it necessary to speak, and the quiet had nothing uncomfortable in it. Frank was making his morning noise. Tobias went out to feed him and came back to find her standing at the kitchen table, looking at the photograph. She finished the coffee, set the cup down, and went back to the spare room. On the 3rd day she was well enough to be restless. He found her in the barn working through the horse's feet with the economy of someone who has handled animals from practical need, picking up each hoof in turn, checking it with a level, unhurried attention. Frank favors the right four. Stone bruise. Looks old. I know. Been poulticing it. She nodded and set the hoof down. She moved through the work of the ranch in those first days, the way water moves through a landscape, finding channels, doing what was needed, not making any announcement of it. A hinge on the feed room door that had been sticking for 2 months got repaired using a bent nail and a scrap of rawhide from the tack pile, in a way that would not have occurred to him. She found which section of garden fence the rabbits were using and closed it with wire from the supply shed. In the spare room, the shelf reorganized itself overnight so that the things she needed were within reach. Small adjustments, each one correct, none of them requiring comment. On the 5th day, she asked him, in the direct, information-gathering way that she asked about most things, what the section of rangeland to the east of the tank had been used for before he acquired it. He told her what he knew. A previous rancher had tried cattle, found the water unreliable, and moved on. She nodded and was quiet for a moment, and then described a spring she thought was probably active on that side of the ridge, based on the vegetation pattern she had seen while walking that morning. He had not known there was a spring there. He had ranched this land for 7 years and had not known. He went to look that afternoon and found she was right. He paid attention after that with even more care than before. On the 4th evening, with the wind off the mountains rattling the west window and the fire doing what it could against the cold in the walls, the conversation moved to Nathan, more fully than it had in the loft, the specific texture of who he had been, rather than just what had happened to him. The spotted mare that had followed him around the relay station yard like a dog after the first 30 days of work. Not because he'd trained her to, but because she'd decided he was worth following. The method he used to build trust with animals that didn't want to be handled. Long patience, never forcing, always letting the animal make the approach, no matter how long it took. The way the other workers at the station had started bringing their problem horses to him, and how he'd handled each one with the same unhurried care. She talked about him the way you talk about someone you have been carrying inside you and are finally setting down for a moment, not to abandon but to rest. Then it was Tobias's turn. The story of Marta's death came out of him quietly, in the careful way that a man speaks about something he has rehearsed in his own mind many times, and has not spoken aloud often enough to make it easy. Cage had appeared at the inquest and described an accidental discharge. He had fired because a rider near the road made a movement he interpreted as threatening, and the bullet was intended for the ground as a warning. The sheriff closed the enquiry in 6 days. The other rider that day, the tax collector who had retained Cage as escort, had privately told someone afterward that Cage had not fired toward the ground, that the shot had been level and deliberate. He had been specific about it. He had used the word deliberate. The tax collector had relocated to El Paso 2 months after the inquest. Through a chain of 2 or 3 people, Tobias had learned that this relocation had been financially assisted. Bidzí sat with this. The fire was the only sound for a while. The fire settled for a moment. When he comes here, what will you do? Nothing, Tobias replied. He had seen no one, heard nothing, noticed no sign of anyone. He would turn Cage back toward the road, but Cage would search the property first. Yes, and that was what the root cellar's false floor was for. Marta had built it for winter stores, knowing a hard winter could leave you cut off from town for weeks, and a well-concealed supply meant the difference between eating and not. The floor was invisible unless you knew to remove the right shelf panel, and the panel was currently behind a stack of seed sacks. He had spent the previous afternoon making it ready for this purpose. You thought about this before I came down from the loft. I've had 3 days. Something crossed her face briefly, not quite a smile, but related to one. It came and went in the firelight, and then she was looking at the fire again. In those evenings they began to trade other things, smaller, quieter than the events. He learned that she spoke Spanish as fluently as English, and some German she had acquired from a mission school teacher, who had recognized in her a particular capacity for language and pushed it as far as the curriculum allowed. She had traveled this country since childhood and knew it with the specificity of someone who has learned a landscape from necessity rather than leisure, which creek crossings ran shallow in March, which cottonwood stands marked reliable water, what the cloud patterns off the southern peaks meant for the next day's weather. She knew the birds by their calls. She could name the visible stars and the seasons they marked. She could read ground the way that some people read faces. He told her about Frank's stone bruise and the fence wire incident that had caused it. She told him about a particular buckskin gelding at the relay station that had convinced 6 different riders it was impossible to saddle before Nathan spent 3 days proving otherwise. They talked about horses the way people talk about anything they love, without quite knowing they are confessing something. One evening she asked about Marta. He told her what he could, not all of it at once, but enough. The kitchen where they had learned each other's rhythms over years. The hearthstones they'd laid on a hot August Saturday, Marta insisting on placing the cornerstones herself and getting it right on the first try. The river photograph, taken by a touring daguerreotypist who had stopped at the ranch for water and offered to make the image as payment. The specific acoustics of a house where only one person is breathing. He described the inquest and Cage's face during it, and the tax collector in El Paso, and the 3 years that had produced nothing but more of themselves. She listened without making any of it smaller. When he finished, there was a quiet between them that had some weight to it, the weight of something heard and held with appropriate care, not reduced or reframed or moved past quickly. "She sounds like someone who wasted nothing," Bidzí said it with precision, the way she said most things. "That's exactly right." They remained by the fire until it burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the scrubland in long, slow passes, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and it occurred to Tobias, sitting in the same room he had sat in alone for 3 years, that the room no longer had the specific resonance of an empty space. Whether that was because of the past week's events, or because of the woman sitting across the fire from him, thinking her own private thoughts, he could not entirely separate. He did not try to. On the 6th day, Delwood Cage came to the ranch. Tobias was at the east fence line driving a replacement post when he heard the approach. At least 2 horses, possibly 3, from the direction of the Presidio cut, moving with purpose. He kept working. He drove the post with the steady rhythm of a man with nothing on his mind but the next stroke. And when Cage came over the low rise with 2 hired riders behind him, Tobias straightened up slowly and shaded his eyes and looked at them with the mild expression of a man whose morning has been interrupted by something routine. Cage rode the grulla with the left stirrup set a notch shorter than the right. He swung down and the left leg caught him in the cold air, the hitch more pronounced than it had been at the inquest 3 years earlier. The accumulation of time on it. The 2 riders behind him stayed mounted. Cage moved through the pleasantries with practiced ease, his face arranged into the expression that worked in these situations, concerned, cooperative, fundamentally reasonable. There had been trouble at Presidio, a theft from an army payroll courier, significant amount, Apache woman believed responsible, tracks leading somewhere into this rangeland. Had Tobias noticed anything? A stranger passing through, any disturbed ground, anything at all? Tobias rubbed the back of his neck and looked out across his land with the expression of a man making a genuine effort to recollect. He had been in the south pastures since Monday, working the east fence line most of the week. Hadn't been to the north quarter since at least Sunday, maybe longer. Couldn't say no one had come through. The creek crossing east of the barn was the natural route, and he hadn't specifically looked for sign there. A pause while Cage considered this. Then, he would appreciate a look around the property. "Go ahead," Tobias replied. "Barn first. Probably north loft is warm and out of the wind. Obvious shelter for someone hurt and moving slowly." He watched them ride to the barn and turned back to his fence post. He heard the loft boards take weight, heard the horses shift in their stalls. He drove his post and counted his breaths, and listened to the sounds a barn makes with 3 strangers working through it. And when Cage came back across the yard 20 minutes later, he kept his eyes on the post until the footsteps were 10 feet away. Nothing there. Thought as much, Tobias said. Anyone who came through without him noticing would have been careful about it. Cage looked at the ranch house. Tobias pointed out it was his home and his private property, and mentioned that a warrant would normally be involved. A hairline fracture appeared in Cage's pleasantness. Tobias let it sit for a beat, then allowed as how he had nothing to hide, and they went inside. He walked Cage through the kitchen, the front room, the spare room, which smelled of nothing but dust and cold air, the cot stripped to bare ticking, the pitcher empty on the chest. He did not mention the root cellar. Cage did not raise it. In the kitchen, Cage stopped at the table. He was looking at Marta's photograph. Something happened in Tobias's chest that had no outlet. "Your wife," Cage said. "Yes. A terrible thing. I've thought about it many times. Have you?" 2 words, flat and even. Nothing in them for Cage to grip. Cage looked at him for a moment. Then he lifted his hat brim slightly and settled it back. He appreciated the cooperation. He said, if anything unusual turned up, Tobias should get word to the office right away. "First thing," Tobias said. He stood on the porch and watched them take the ranch road back toward the Presidio cut. He watched until the dust settled and the road was empty. Then he went to the root cellar, moved the shelf panel, and knocked twice on the false floor in the pattern they had agreed on. Bidzí came up from the dark below slowly, pale from the blood loss and from the hour in the confined cold, but her face held the same level quality it had carried in the barn on the first night. She stood and breathed steadily for a moment. Then she walked to the kitchen and sat at the table. He put the kettle on. He'll be back. Tobias set out the cups, not the kind of man to leave something unresolved. Her hands wrapped around the cup when he poured. "The relay station," she said. After the conviction, Cage had come back there, gone through Nathan's bunk looking for anything he might have missed, taken what he found. Next time he brought men here, he would not knock first. Tobias was quiet for a moment, thinking about his land, the dip east of the old water tank that offered a clear sightline over both approach routes simultaneously, the barn loft window that looked directly down the road approach. 7 years of knowing every gully and rise and sightline on this property. 3 or 4 riders, standard pattern for a search, 2 sides, spread the flanks, close the center. A pause, but he doesn't know this ground. I do. She looked at him. Then her gaze moved to the mantel where Marta's pistol sat in its leather wrap. She didn't say anything, but he saw the look and understood it. Breeze, the county sheriff, came 2 days later. A careful man, neither dishonest nor particularly brave, who wrote in his ledger and indicated he would need to file the relevant paperwork with the county seat. Tobias answered everything plainly and in the same order each time. Bidzí stayed in the spare room. Breeze left without incident and was not seen again that week. The shoulder healed in those days with the same methodical precision Bidzí brought to everything. It was tight and painful, visible in the way she held herself, the slight protective offset of the left arm. But she did not permit the pain to make decisions on her behalf. By the 8th day she could raise the arm above her shoulder without stopping. The evenings by the fire continued, and now that the larger things had been exchanged, there was room for the smaller ones. She taught him the Mescalero name for the mountains visible to the northwest, and the story her grandmother had about their formation, which involved a disagreement between 2 ancient forces that had been ongoing since before the memory of any living person. He gave back the summer when Marta had convinced him to try planting tobacco in the kitchen garden. What had happened to it, and how they had both found it funnier in retrospect than it had been at the time. These were not the significant things. They were the kind of things that accumulate into the knowledge of a person. She described the Mescalero practice of reading landscape for memory, the way certain rock formations served as landmarks not just geographically but historically, marking where agreements had been made, where losses had occurred, where things had changed permanently. Walking through a known country was, in this way, walking through a kind of record. Tobias thought about this for some time. He thought about what it meant that he had stayed in the Davis Mountains after Marta's death rather than leaving, that he had, perhaps without knowing it, been doing something similar, keeping the record intact. One evening she described her father, who had been highly regarded for his capacity to hold 2 opposing positions in his mind simultaneously and find the path between them that cost both parties the least. The look she gave Tobias was brief and direct, not in manner, she observed, in method. He thought about this for a while, then he nodded once, slowly. She nodded back, and the fire did its work, and outside the wind came and went across the rangeland. On the 8th morning Tobias was at the kitchen window when he saw them. 5 riders, Cage in front on the road, moving at a pace that was not here to ask questions. 1 rider cutting east through the scrub on a line that would bring him around behind the barn. 3 more spreading south and west. He went to the spare room. Bidzí was already up, dressed, sitting on the edge of the cot. Tobias held up 5 fingers. Cage on the road, one going around back. She stood. North track out of the barn puts you in the open immediately. He kept his voice flat and low. But the loft window looks straight down the road. Cage will come from the front. She held his eyes, that thorough, measuring look. He went to the mantel and took down Marta's pistol. He unwrapped the leather, checked the load, closed the cylinder, held it out. She took it, checked it herself, cylinder, action, sights, with the clean efficiency of someone who handles firearms from practical need rather than show. Then she looked at him once more, and whatever she found in his face resolved the last part of the calculation, and she was out the kitchen door and across the yard and through the barn's side entrance, low and fast, well before the riders cleared the rise. Tobias took the Winchester and stood on the porch. He had prepared nothing to say. He stood with his hands loose and his weight easy, and watched Cage come over the rise with 4 men spreading behind him. And when they reached the fence line, he raised one hand the way you raise a hand at a neighbor's approach. Unhurried, nothing urgent. Cage pulled up at the fence. He did not dismount this time. The pleasant expression was entirely gone from his face, and what was underneath it was narrow and certain. Tobias, step down from that porch and walk to me. Why? Presidio County Deputy Tobias stepped off the porch and walked through the gate and stopped 10 feet from the horse. Before we go further, Tobias held Cage's eyes. The threatening movement on the Lajitas road, the one you described at the inquest, the one that made you fire, what was it? Cage's jaw went still. That was answered at the inquest, not to me. Something moved behind Cage's eyes, a decision arriving. The hand that had been resting on the saddle horn began to drop toward the hip, the weight shifting forward in the saddle. The shot from the barn loft window was a single clean crack in the cold March air. Cage went sideways off the grula. The 2 flanking riders wheeled and drew, and one of them fired toward the barn, wide, panic-driven, hitting the high wood above the loft window. And Tobias brought the Winchester up and put 2 rounds into the dirt directly in front of the flanking horses, not at the men, at the ground, which was enough. Both horses bolted sideways, and their riders went immediately into the consuming work of staying mounted. The rider who had gone around back came around the north corner of the barn at a canter, and pulled up hard when he saw what the road held. He took in Cage on the ground, the barn loft window, Tobias standing in the open with the Winchester, and the arithmetic of it resolved in his face in a clear direction. He turned his horse and rode. The 2 flanking men, horses steadied, looked at each other, then at what was in the road, then at Tobias. Then they followed. The road went quiet in the particular way that follows a violent conclusion. The birds absent, even the wind seeming to pause for a moment. Tobias walked to where Cage had fallen. The shot had been clean, center mass, the deputy's own pistol half drawn in his right hand at the moment of reaching. Tobias stood over him for a while. He thought about Marta on the Lajitas road, and the level shot the tax collector had described to someone who had described it to someone who had eventually described it to Tobias. He thought about 9 minutes, and a paper knife, and a man named Purvis, who was never called to give evidence. He thought about 3 years of patient waiting that had produced nothing except more of itself. What he felt was not satisfaction. That word was too simple and too clean. What he felt was something resolving, the way a clock sounds when you finally fix the broken gear and it starts keeping the right time again. Not silence, the right sound. The loft ladder creaked inside the barn. Bidzí came through the barn door and crossed the yard and stood beside him. She looked at Cage in the road without speaking. She still held Marta's pistol at her side. They stood there together in the cold morning air for a long moment. "I'll bury him on the property." Tobias looked at the road. "The men who rode off will report to someone. There'll be questions. You have answers." "I do." He came armed and without a warrant and reached for his weapon when confronted. "I have a witness, a guest who was here legally, recovering from a wound, who was in the loft because I'd put her there in case the men who had shot her came back with numbers." A pause. A quiet moment. "Substantially true," Bidzí said. "It is." He took the pistol from her, checked it, wrapped it back in the leather. When you're fit to ride, I'll go north with you. Help get the money where it needs to be. She looked at him. 3 days from the ranch, she said, the words flat and factual, not an objection, just the arithmetic laid out. I know. The wind came off the Davis Mountains, cold and clean, carrying pine resin from the high country. Tobias. She used his name with full weight and no decoration. Why would you do that? He thought about what Marta would have said in the same position. She would have said it plainly. Because it's the right thing. He had spent 3 years saying nothing when the right thing would have cost him something. He was finished with that. Because it's the right thing. Plain as that. Bidzí looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the economy she brought to everything. He went to find the shovel. Breeze came 3 times in the following week. He wrote in his ledger, asked the same questions in slightly different order each time, and filed everything upward. The county seat took 2 weeks to respond. The response effectively closed the matter. Cage had not been universally admired at the administrative level. The hired men had not come forward, and the facts of the situation were defensible under territorial law. Tobias did not read the final report, but he heard its conclusion. In the last week of March, Tobias saddled 2 horses, and they rode north. 3 days on the river road. They took turns at watch while the other slept. Not because they arranged it, but because it was the obvious thing and they were both people who did the obvious thing without needing to discuss it first. He learned that she had traveled this country since childhood and knew it with a specificity that made his 7 years look superficial by comparison. Which creek crossings ran shallow in March, which cottonwood stands marked reliable water, what the cloud patterns off the southern peaks meant for tomorrow's weather. She could read a track in dry ground that he would have walked past without registering. She named the birds as they moved through various territories. He told her things about the Davis Mountains that you only learn from working the same ground across many seasons. The particular details, which draws held water longest after a rain, which ridgeline caught the first light of a winter morning, that don't appear on any map and are not written down anywhere. The 3 days were not difficult. By the end of them he had known her less than 2 weeks, and he had the clear, uncomplicated sense that he would go on knowing her for the rest of his life. They mailed the satchel from the Presidio post office by registered mail. The clerk weighed the envelope with professional indifference and issued a receipt and a tracking number, noting both in his own ledger, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times. Bidzí folded the receipt into her belt. The tracking number she memorized. On the road south, with the mountains holding the late afternoon light at their peaks the way they did best, Tobias asked where she would go when this was settled. A pause. North, probably. Her brother was buried near the reservation. Natan's widow was there. The children. She was not sure she would call it home in the way the word usually meant, but she did not know where else to call it either. He understood this. He had called the Davis Mountains home for 3 years after losing Marta, because it was where his work and his mornings were. But home in the deeper sense of the word had been absent from it for a long time. You could come back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, if you wanted. The spare room is there. She looked at him. The east fence line is never going to stop needing work, and someone who can fix a hinge with a bent nail and a scrap of rawhide would be useful around a place like this. A silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it. A curve-billed thrasher called from a stand of scrub to the east. Are you asking me to stay? Bidzí said. I'm telling you the room is there. I'd rather it was occupied than not. A pause. That's as plain as I know how to put it. A long pause. The horses moved at their steady pace. The mountains rose ahead of them in the late afternoon light, holding the gold the way they always held it this time of day. Yes, Bidzí said. He nodded once. The arithmetic settled, the direction clear, and they rode on toward the Davis Mountains with the afternoon light moving alongside them. They returned to the Davis Mountains in the late afternoon, when the light was at its best on that land, coming low off the peaks and turning the dust of the yard a particular shade of gold that Tobias had looked at 7 years running and still thought was the finest thing his ranch made in any weather. Frank put his head over the stall door and complained about 2 days without a morning carrot. Bidzí went to check the fence repair on the kitchen garden, which it held. He started a fire in the kitchen hearth. She came in and made the coffee, because she knew where it was and knew the proportions, and they sat at the table while the light moved across the worn wood and the photograph. Tobias looked at the photograph the way he always looked at it, with the quiet, uncomplicated acknowledgement of a man who carries his grief without letting it become his whole geography. She would have liked you. Tobias looked at the photograph. Marta, she would have been your friend. A pause. I think I would have liked her. Bidzee's voice was quiet, the words placed carefully. They drank the coffee. Outside, the mountains held the last light at their peaks, and the scrubland settled into its night sounds. The poor Will calling from somewhere east of the garden fence, Frank moving in his stall, the small persistent wind through the kitchen garden where the repair was holding. That spring they married in the kitchen where Marta used to bake. The witness was a survey agent from town named Hooper, a quiet man with no particular curiosity about other people's arrangements. Bidzí wore the beadwork her mother had made her, ivory shells on deep blue in the Mescalero pattern, the work of many weeks, the intention of a lifetime. Each piece of the design represented something specific, a direction, a season, a relationship that the maker wished to acknowledge and carry forward. Tobias wore his good shirt and his hat, because occasions could ask some things of a man without asking everything, and he was not naturally given to occasions. Hooper wrote the names in his ledger. He went home. Tobias and Bidzí stayed in the kitchen, and the fire burned down to coals, and the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved to change either one. In May, a letter came from Presidio, forwarded from the reservation postal agent to the Marfa postmaster, then collected by Hooper on a supply run, and brought out to the ranch. Natton's widow had received the registered package. She wrote in Spanish, one careful page, no word wasted, with the handwriting of someone who had learned to write under difficult conditions and kept at it. She was grateful to whoever had sent it. She did not know who it was. The youngest child, the boy 3 months old in March, had started pulling himself upright against the furniture and seemed inclined toward getting into things. She had managed the winter. She noted that some things have a way of being made right in the end, even when the making takes longer than it should. Bidzí read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in the chest with the beadwork, with the things worth keeping. Tobias went back to the east fence line. By summer, the spare room had become a workroom. A table Hooper brought on his cart, tools ordered from Presidio, the shelf reorganized again to suit the new work. She mended tack for the neighboring ranches, repaired equipment, and within 2 months had become the person people from the valley came to first for that kind of work. The income was modest but entirely hers, kept in a ledger in her own handwriting, in a small desk placed at the window, overlooking the mountains. Frank's stone bruise healed by July. The east fence line remained a chronic problem, as it had always been. The late afternoons continued to be the best time of day, the light coming low off the peaks, the dust of the yard turning gold. The poor Will calling from wherever poor Wills go between dusk and dark. Tobias would come in from the work, and Bidzí would be there at the table or at the workroom, or on the porch with the mountains in front of her. And that level, unhurried attention she brought to everything, the same attention she had turned on him in the dark of the barn on that first night, which had not been fear and had not been submission, but had been the full weight of a person taking careful measure of whether another person could be trusted with something important. He had been found worth trusting. He was glad of that. The cabin no longer sounded like a house with only one person breathing. The kitchen garden was better maintained than it had been in years. The horses were in the best condition they had been since before Marta died, and in the evenings, when the fire was going and the coffee was on, and the mountains held the dark at a distance outside the window, there was no longer the specific silence of a man sitting alone in a house that is too large for one person and not ready to admit it. Some things take longer than they should to come right. Some of the best arrivals happen without any announcement, bleeding in the dark, carrying a stolen satchel, looking at you with eyes that do not flinch, and ask nothing from you except that you make the right decision under pressure, without time to think it through. Tobias Vance had made that decision. He was glad he had. And every evening that ended with the fire burning low, and 2 people not in any hurry to be anywhere else, he was glad again. There is a kind of life that a person builds slowly, decision by decision, out of the materials the territory provides. In the Davis Mountains in 1881, the materials were hard, and the territory was not inclined to make anything easy. But Tobias had built once before with the person he loved, and he knew from that experience that the building itself was the thing, the daily work of it, the small adjustments, the particular satisfaction of a problem solved with what you have on hand, rather than what you wish you had. He had not expected to find himself building again. He had not expected a great deal of what had happened in the months since March. Bidzí had her own accounting of it, which she kept in the ledger she maintained in her own handwriting, and which was not available to him. But there were things he could observe. She wrote letters to Natan's widow regularly, and the letters grew over time from brief and careful to longer and more ordinary in tone, the way correspondence does when it is no longer performing reassurance, but simply continuing a relationship. She learned the particular rhythms of the ranch, which tasks were better done in the morning and which ones the afternoon, which neighboring ranchers were trustworthy and which were merely friendly, how Frank's stone bruise had healed but would need watching in hard weather. She learned these things the way she learned most things, by watching carefully for a while and then proceeding with certainty. He learned her, too, with the same patient attention. By the second winter, the cabin had accumulated the particular quality of a space inhabited by two people who have worked out their arrangement. Not perfectly, not without occasional friction, but genuinely, in the way that people who are honest with each other work things out. The kitchen garden was flourishing. The horses were in excellent condition. The east fence line was, as always, in need of attention. Some things you do not fix completely. You maintain them. You keep coming back. That was enough. In the Davis Mountains, at the end of a long day, with the fire going and the coffee on and the mountains holding the dark at a distance outside the window, that had turned out to be quite enough.